Stephen C. Productions.
I had a girl, we caught her hiding in the back of a pickup truck, and she was like up top of the canopy, and just, we call them, it's not, it doesn't sound like a very nice term, but they get called trunk monkeys, right? Because they're hiding in the trunk or in some weird space. And this girl, she must have been about 80 pounds soaking wet. She refused to answer any questions because we arrested her. Of course, you have to report on entry. And because she was a prisoner in an intergalactic war.
You're listening to Talking from Experience. If you're an experienced listener, welcome back. And if you didn't know, you about to learn. My name is Steven, and I am your host. On Talking from Experience, I have casual, insightful, and entertaining conversations with community leaders, creative minds, and people from diverse facets of society. My goal with every conversation is to help you understand the world through their individual experiences. Today I'm talking with Grant Patterson. He's a former Canadian Border Services officer and the author of 18 books. His bestseller, A Life on the Line, My Unexpected Career with the Canadian Border Services Agency, depicts some of his wildest experiences protecting Canada's border from, well, crazy people. He'll be sharing some of those stories with us today, and man, is there some interesting stuff that happens on the U.S.'s northern border. Check it out.
As Private Joker says in Full Metal Jacket, I wanted to meet interesting people from different cultures and kill them.
Oh man, I love that movie.
Yeah, I met that guy, Matthew Modine. Nice guy. That's the thing, working in border services, you get to meet a lot of the celebrities because they come up to Vancouver all the time, right? Make movies up here because it's cheaper. And he was a cool guy. He had a lot of good stories.
I'm getting some kind of like background noise on your end. I don't know if it's like music or TV or something.
It's the birds. Hang on a second.
Oh.
Is that better now?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, my kids got 4 budgies. So anytime they hear you talking, they think it's time to start singing.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, my grandma has 2. Well, she had 2. One of them died, but
they do that.
As soon as any type of noise starts happening, they go crazy.
Yeah. They're fun to watch, though.
Oh, yeah. At one point, we had just the one bird, and it was a female, so what I would like to do for fun was pull up audio of a male bird, and me and my wife would laugh because normally the bird would just be making these ugly, just like loud screaming type sounds, and then once it heard the male bird, it started to make all these beautiful little like chirping and singing noises. I was like, wow.
See, the people and birds are both phonies. The moral of that story.
So, how did you get into law enforcement?
My dad was a cop. He was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So I kind of grew up with it. And, originally, though, my interest lay in artistic pursuits because my mom was a teacher and she was sort of the more artistic one. So I kind of tended to take after her. But, my dad took me on a ride along when I was like 14, which would never happen today. But I seem to recall all kinds of exciting stuff happening. And I realized, when you're in the front seat of a police car, people really treat you differently, even if you're not in uniform. So I thought, that's kind of cool. But I just kind of put that away in my back pocket. And I studied theater in college at first. And then, of course, what do you do with a theater diploma? Most actors starve. If you get a deodorant commercial, you think it's a great thing, right? I didn't want to live on people's couches till I was 40, right? So I decided, what am I going to do, right? I thought about joining the Army, and I looked into it, and they were like, oh yeah, we have openings for dental hygiene assistants. I'm like, what? I'm not going to join the Army to look in people's mouths. I want to blow stuff up. But, so that's the Canadian Army for you. At least it was at the time. And then, I decided I want to get into law enforcement, and it was a very tough competitive racket back then. A lot more people wanted to be cops. Hardly anybody does today for obvious reasons. And I went to university, Simon Fraser, got my criminology degree. And finally, 2000, I wrote the test for what was then customs, passed, got in. Surprisingly easy process it was back then. And yeah, that's how my career started. I did 2 years at the airport. I was there for 9/11, which was a really crazy situation because all the flights from the States got diverted to us. And a lot of the people on the planes, they didn't know what had happened until they got off and they started seeing the plane bam, bam on a continuous loop. And that was pretty terrible. And then I transferred to the land border, the border between the US and Canada, on the main highway between Vancouver and Tijuana. So as you can imagine, that's just a straight shot of misery, but really interesting. You see pretty much everything. And, I had my fill of that. It was fun while it lasted. Then eventually I wanted to change, and the artistic part of me started coming to life again.
Well, besides the being treated differently, sitting in the front seat of a cop car, what is it that you saw or experienced that made you think, this is kind of cool?
Well, the thing is, it's like I've always been fairly independent-minded person, and the thing with law enforcement is a lot of people think that, cops are kind of like robots. They're just out there just following the rules and ticking the boxes. But the fact is, actually, your bread and butter is decision making. And the laws, particularly in Canada, are written not, that you take orders from your bosses and do what you're told. It's that you make individual decisions based on what you think is reasonable under the circumstances. And that's the aspect that always really appealed to me. Especially at the border, there's so much questioning, talking to different people and trying to figure out what's going on with them. Is this person lying to me? If they are, is it something that's important or something that's not? That always really appealed to me, the independent decision making and just the people you meet, some of the wildest things, right? And I mean, let's put it this way. I always put it this way to people I taught in later years who wanted to get into law enforcement. If you work for a company where they put those little things on the end of shoelaces and you're going to tell people work stories, is anyone going to care? But if you're in law enforcement or jobs like that, being a nurse, being a firefighter, something like that, you tell your work stories, people are going to listen. And if you're a show off like me, well, that's a big incentive too, right?
Well, so what's the real crazy one that you got right off the top of your head?
I had a girl, we caught her hiding in the back of a pickup truck. And she was like up top of the canopy and just, we call them, it's not, it doesn't sound like a very nice term, but they get called trunk monkeys, right? Because they're hiding in the trunk or in some weird space. And this girl, she must have been about 80 pounds soaking wet. She refused to answer any questions because we arrested her. Of course, you have to report on entry. And because she was a prisoner in an intergalactic war. She was entirely convinced that we were space aliens who had taken her prisoner in a war. And unfortunately, you do get a lot of that. The border is a kind of a beacon for the mentally ill. So you do get some very crazy situations. There's just so many. I mean, I wound up writing a book about it, right? So there's just tons of stuff in there. 2:00 in the morning, I'm out there, 2:30, and nothing going on at all, just total quiet. And I'm out in the booth, and I hear this roaring engine sound. I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna get rammed here, because some people sometimes do that. They just bull their way through. And this pickup truck comes flying over the hill, Dukes of Hazzard style. Bounces, screeches to a stop, shower of sparks. And I'm like, I got my hand on my gun. I'm like, what is going on here, man? I don't know what's going to happen next. And this kid, maybe about 19, 20, wearing baby Stewie pajamas, pulls to a stop, very polite, says, is this the way to Canada? I'm like, what was with that driving, man? Like, are you okay? And are you drunk? He's like, no, but I just smoked a shitload of meth. I'm like, oh, man. Right. And unfortunately for him, he was an illegal too. So when a guy like that shows up, it's game over. It's game over. At least it was back then, right? I think, and it was his dad's truck too, and his dad was illegal too. So the whole family was screwed by that whole thing.
Oh, wow.
I had a guy. It's always the early morning ones are the weirdest. 6 o'clock in the morning, guy shows up, kind of a scruffy looking white dude. He doesn't match the car he's driving, which is one thing you learn is that people should kind of look like the car they're driving in, right? If they're a well-dressed person in a Porsche, that's not that weird. You know, if they're a scruffy guy in a scruffy pickup truck, that's not that weird. If they're a scruffy guy in a nice-looking car, what's up with that, right? So it just makes you kind of ask another question. So the guy's driving a really nice new VW, like soccer mom car, right? And he doesn't fit it at all. So I'm like, well, whose car is this? And he says, I don't know. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? I mean, either you do know and you don't want to tell me, or you don't know because you stole it. I stole it. I'm like, oh man, get out of the car. So I'm hooking him up. I'm like, why'd you steal the car? He's like, to get away from the voices in my head. So on the back seat, he's got this massive axe and a pair of work boots. And I'm like, what's this? And he's like, oh, well, I just wanted to come to Canada and be a lumberjack. I'm like, all right. So I'm frisking him and I take off his beanie and he's got a tinfoil hat underneath.
Wow.
Turns out, like I sent called the sheriffs down it was somewhere in Oregon. And I said, could you go check on this address? Because I've got this car here and it's not coming up stolen on the computer, but the guy told me he stole it and it's not registered to him. Could you go around and check to see that these people aren't chopped into little bits? And so the sheriff's deputy goes out there and he's like, yeah, they're alive. And their first question was, where's our car? So I guess he busted into the house, middle of the night, stolen the keys, and then just barreled straight for Canada. 5-hour drive.
Well, is the process for becoming a lumberjack that easy? Just show up with an axe and work boots?
And a stolen car? Yeah, I think the tinfoil hat is the main thing. You got to have one of those.
Yeah, shoot. I wonder if there might just, by some coincidence, be some kind of actual beacon, for those kind of people. Only thing that I keep thinking of is like, well, what about that girl that was hiding in the back? Like, what about the person driving?
Well, the guy driving was no great shakes either. He's, you get these funny little feelings for certain regions of the continent. The sort of people they produce, and he's one we would call California dreaming, right? The very typical sort of somewhat privileged California kids who've maybe spent too much of mommy and daddy's money on recreational narcotics. Yeah. There's some funny other ones too. I know my counterparts back east, they used to call Ohio Planet OH10 because it had a habit of producing some really strange people. I actually got a couple guys from Planet OH10 rolling up in a real dirty van with some kid they didn't even know, like 14-year-old kid they just picked up, no ID, they had no relation. I'm like, what are you doing? Search the car, there's like 26 guns in there. I'm like, what are you doing? But that's one of the big things at the border is the contrast between Canadian attitudes towards guns and American ones that really keeps the officers quite busy. That's something you really have to spend a lot of time working on people with is, do you have a gun? No. Really? Yeah.
So who produced more guns?
Oh, Americans by far. When Canadians cross the border with a gun, which sometimes happens, they've got a stack of paperwork for you right away. I have a gun. It's in the trunk. It's unloaded. I went down to go shooting in the States. Here's my paperwork, right? And you just don't waste time with those people because they're not a problem. So there are some Americans like that. They're aware of our laws. They're educated shooters. They're respectful, and that's fine, right? So those people are no problem either. But then there's the people who have the Saturday night special in the Burger King bag right next to the driver's seat. And those people are a different story. And then there's organized crime who, they're going to try and recruit the person who looks like a soccer mom to drive a van across the border. Oh, just went for gasoline and groceries, which is the typical Canadian answer. And then she's got 50 Glocks in the car. Got paid $5 or $10,000 to do it. That's where most of the crime guns in Canada come from. They're not legally purchased guns. They're 90% smuggled firearms from the U.S.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Has anything ever gotten like violent or anything like that?
Use of force it happens. I mean, I've probably over 17 years, maybe had about 24 incidents. Usually it's just hand to hand, right? You tell somebody they're under arrest, they don't like that answer. They decide they're not going to go with the program. And at that point, they become resistant. So you grab an arm and you help them down to the ground and you put the handcuffs on. That's usually the extent of it. Sometimes if you think there's a weapon involved, if you think there's a gun on their person, you draw your own weapon and you take them down at gunpoint the same way that they would on the street in the U.S. or anywhere else, really. There are times when, things have got worse than that. One occasion I talk about in my book, one of our officers was shot in the neck by a guy who drove up from, he was a tattoo artist in Nevada, this guy. And the weird thing is we never really figured out why he did it. He just drove up in his mom's van, Washington plates, sent her a text saying, "Mom, I'm sorry," drove up to the booth, and the officer there, Lori, she noticed his stereo was just blasting this death metal. And she said, "Please turn that down," right? He said, "Oh, okay, fine." Goes like he's going to turn it down, grabs a Glock 45, blam, shoots her, and of course all hell breaks loose. And our guys respond, and they see him sitting up there in the driver's seat. They don't know if he's dead or alive. Eventually, they realize that he's put the gun to his own head and blown his brains out. That's probably the worst incident we had, for sure. There are some situations too where the people they're driving is the real threat. And we've had a couple of situations where people just out of their mind, for whatever reason, drugs, psychotic episodes, have plowed into other vehicles in the lineup and killed people. The most recent one was a few years back after I left. Guy in his minivan, loaded up with American gas, because Canadians love to do that, right? They love to go down to the States and buy the cheap gas. And some of them, they really push it so far that we call them gas tankers. They get all these jerry cans in their car, and it's dangerous. We warn people, but people don't listen. And this guy was traveling with all this gas in his car, and some guy from Seattle driving a Porsche having a psychotic episode rammed into him. He was trapped in the van, and our guys couldn't get him out. So sometimes it gets a little brutal.
Wow.
But I would add to that, it's not. I don't think it's anything like what the average street cop in a large city deals with. It's not as bad. And that's one of the problems too, because bad things happen. They just don't happen that often. So sometimes your fellow officers aren't quite convinced that anything bad's going to happen to them today. Whereas if you're going on patrol in Houston, you're ready to go. You ought to be, because bad things will happen often enough that you'll be reminded if you forgot.
Have you ever been to Houston?
Only the airport. All I remember is pretty good bookstore, not bad food, and a good place to stock up on your NASA souvenirs. Yeah.
Yeah, what's funny is I don't know what it is. Like we love the NASA gear. Like
Yeah.
anything.
Well, it's a point of pride, right?
Anything Space City, all that stuff. You'll find it in any little any type of shop.
Yeah. No, it's cool though. It's a point of pride. It should be.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge space program guy.
Yeah, I wonder if like I listen to all kinds of podcasts, and it's like there's one called Astonishing Legends, and they kind of study like these kind of fringe topics, and there's something, it has to be something about borders, right? Like
yeah,
where there's some kind of I don't know what to call it, energy, or it just draws the crazy.
I think what it really comes down to is that people are always looking for the grass to be greener on the other side, and they think if their lives are screwed up, that maybe coming to Canada will fix it. I mean, look at all these people who, when Bush won, or when Obama won, or when Biden won, or whatever, Trump won, I'm going to Canada. Oh, no, it's not that easy, right? I mean, you can't just show up in another person's country and say, I'm going to live here now, right?
Right.
So sometimes it's as simple as that. They think, well, things aren't working out for me, I'm going to go to Canada. But it's not like moving from California to Montana. It's there's a border there. And I guess, what, I have to think, before I worked at the border, how much did I know about the border? Not much. So it's not a question of all these people are all dumbasses. I mean, really, if you don't spend the time there, that's not part of your world, well, you're not going to really know, are you?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, me living closer to the southern border, I see it all the time, and I hear it from people who migrated from Mexico. It's like,
Yeah.
They say the same thing. It's not any easier up here. You still have to work. Like I don't know what it is. Like having family down there. Like, yeah, I think you're 100% correct. The grass is greener for some reason. I feel like some people think that it rains money over here in the U.S. and that nobody needs anything, and everyone's taken care of. The government takes care of you, and
yeah,
it's like it's not at all the case. No matter where you live, you're gonna have to find a way to make a living, find a way to provide for yourself. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I mean, I can certainly understand, given what's going on in Mexico right now, why people are going to want to go north. There's not much, to me, mystery there. If you combine the endemic poverty with the violence, the sickening level of violence in some parts of Mexico now, I mean, it's just completely out of control. So I don't really wonder why people want to do that. I mean, you get kind of cynical about people's refugee claims and stories because we have to deal with that. And sometimes you're like, oh, this is just such crap, man. This guy's just an economic migrant. But then sometimes you deal with people. I remember dealing with this one girl who had testified against MS-13 in El Salvador. And she had the newspaper clippings of herself in hospital after she was shot by them. And there, she was up there making a refugee claim, and it got overturned on some technicality. I recall feeling really bad for her because if anybody should be protected, it's this girl, man, because MS-13 doesn't screw around. If they want you dead, you're going to be dead. So sometimes it's very real, and other times it's a mockery. I don't know. I remember seeing this family of refugees from Mexico showing up, driving a Mercedes with a flatbed trailer towing a BMW. I'm like, well, you could be in fear for your own life, but you definitely don't fit the stereotype. Let's put it that way, right? So you get cynical, but then sometimes you get reminded that it's very real for some people.
It's crazy too with organized crime because something like MS-13, like they're everywhere. Like I even feel like it doesn't matter where you go, like they can probably find you.
And the weird thing is that's what I call a boomerang. that MS-13 is an unintended consequence of getting tough on immigration. Because MS-13 actually was founded in Los Angeles. It wasn't founded in El Salvador. No, it was founded among Salvadorans in Los Angeles. And then a lot of those Salvadorans got deported because they had felony convictions, right? And they wound up down there. And then that's when it really took off, because El Salvador is a country that doesn't have the ability to stand up to something like MS-13 the way the US can. Yeah, and then it just got out of control. It's an interesting story, the birth of that gang.
It's crazy to think, that there's countries that don't have the resources to fend off a large organized crime, and it's.
Yep.
I mean, we're watching it happen in Mexico. Like, it's basically a war zone, and the government is outmanned and outgunned.
Yeah, and they don't have, really with Obrador, they don't really have the moral conviction that some previous Mexican governments have had. I mean, corruption is always a reality in the governance there, but it's a reality in the governance up here too. I just finished reading a very interesting book by a Canadian reporter detailing the effect that money from the Chinese triads that has been laundered through our casinos and our real estate in the Vancouver area in particular has corrupted our system. Where there's money, where there's drugs, and a lot of this money, the Chinese money, comes from fentanyl. Where there's money like that, it gets into everybody's pockets, and it's corrupt. It's a corrupting, corroding influence. I talk about that in my book, Life on the Line, my memoir of my time at the CBSA, about officers I worked with who were corrupt. There were a few instances, 3 I can think of, where it was a money and drugs type of corruption. And one guy, very blatant, a real big shot, going around buying everybody's drinks all the time. Well, the money you make at the border is good, but it's not that good, right? You can't afford to shout the drinks every weekend. And this guy's excuse was always, oh, well, my family owns a blueberry farm. Okay, must be very successful. I like blueberries too, not that much. But anyways, I didn't like him because he was a big talker. I didn't know about him buying everybody drinks, but apparently he was an instructor too, and he would teach these guys, because apparently he was the big drug hotshot. He was going to show us all how to get these big loads of cocaine. Well, yeah, he did. He was telling people, at a certain point in time, you're going to get approached. People are going to ask you to wave a load through or whatever. That never happened to me in my whole career. Never. Because my next words would have been, you're under arrest. Okay. You don't get approached like that, generally speaking, unless you have shown that you are open, or that you can be blackmailed, that you do something like snort lines of coke off a table in a nightclub that can be used against you, or you gallivant around with hookers. But unless you're doing stuff like that, you're not going to get approached. And if I had heard that, if I'd known knowing what I know now, certainly I would have said, what is wrong with this guy? This isn't right. Well, it turns out this guy was letting motorhomes go. $50,000 for everyone he waved through. And the motorhomes would have cocaine and handguns in them every time.
Wow. And
they have no idea how many he waved through, but eventually a joint CBSA RCMP operation took him down. Yeah, he was bad. He was dirty, and he wasn't the only one. There's a lot of money there, and in my personal opinion, a corrupt border officer can do more damage than a corrupt street cop, because you have that ability to wave through big loads, as opposed to just letting street level weight go, right? Because most of the time at the street level, the dope has been stepped on and cut to a much lower purity level, so it's worth less. So the amount of money that a corrupt officer can make is probably a lot less. But at the border, that stuff is 99% pure. And yeah, and every one of those smuggled guns is worth probably about $5,000 to $6,000 on the Canadian black market. So 50 of them at one go, that's a lot of money.
Wow. And yeah, that's they were getting smuggled from the US to Canada.
Yeah, and it's usually a sort of a reciprocal deal. The cash will go back down south. And it's often, again, it's hard because the people moving the cash, they feel a little less vulnerable than they do if they had guns or coke in the car. So people, it's just, trying to put one over on the tax man. Who cares? Because I know there was this family that would come up. They're like, fresh-faced, cleanly scrubbed family coming up from Seattle. And I sent them in a couple times for a search. I just knew there was something wrong for them. But the guys inside just couldn't find it. And they would, well, why are you coming to Canada? Well, we're going to Canadian Tire. No, Americans don't go to Canadian Tire. That's why they call it Canadian Tire. Right? Americans don't even know about Canadian Tire. But the guy, it's this like chain of stores that started out, it's automotive stuff and other things too, right?
All right.
But it's only a Canadian thing. Americans don't know about it, don't care about it. But I guess the guy did a little bit of research and figured, oh, yeah, Canadian Tire. That's something that they'll say, oh, of course, you know our stuff, right? But no, I guess a few months later, I was reading a bulletin and U.S. Customs had caught them with $150,000 in their radiator. So they're part of this whole economy. The guns and the dope come north. BC Bud and the stacks of cash, they go south.
That's wild. Yeah, it's interesting to me. When I have traveled to Mexico, and it's a giant line of cars to get from Mexico to the U.S.
Yeah,
and especially around the holidays, it can take up to 3 hours waiting in line just to get to the other side of the border. And most of the time when you're coming from the US into Mexico, there's not a lot of traffic. And I've always found that to be like really interesting. And I met someone once who was like, oh yeah, like it's so easy to get stuff into Mexico. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, oh yeah, like at one point that somebody had, I don't know the whole details, but he ended up with a backpack full of marijuana, and he's like, "Yeah, just walked over to Mexico, just across the border."
Who smuggles drugs into Mexico? Are you crazy? No, but this is the thing. I wondered about this, and this is what makes you a bit cynical is hearing Mexican government officials complain about these American guns coming into Mexico. Oh, really? Are you that concerned? If you are, then why red light, green light? You've ever gone through their system.
Yes.
It's all completely randomized.
Yes.
Right? And it's completely ineffective, right? It's not the way that you catch people smuggling. You catch people smuggling through observation, questioning, and intelligence. And they don't do any of that. So they can't be that concerned with American guns. And another thing, they had this press conference. They were showing off these American guns they were so worried about. They're all from the late 70s, early 80s, U.S. military. And what that tells me is those are Contra guns, right? Those guns were sent down there by Reagan.
Wow.
Right? And they're not being smuggled across by good old boys in pickup trucks. No.
It's interesting because the most searching I've ever seen going down into Mexico is when you're actually riding in the passenger buses.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you take like Greyhound or something like that down to Mexico, those take a really long time. And I've always wondered, like, why is it that the people traveling, and it's annoying, like they make you take your luggage out from under the bus and you carry it through the X-ray machine or whatever it is. heavy loaded back onto the bus, and it's like, you know, you could have just used red light, green light over here, and get the same result.
Do you know what it is, Stephen? And you know what? And I think it comes back to the class structure of Mexican society. You're not going to run into any senators' sons on that Greyhound.
Right.
You might if you do that to a car, but you're not going to run into any important people or any, oil executives' daughters. They're not going to be on that bus.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. I'd never thought about it like that.
Yeah. That's one of the problems that makes it's so hard for the people to trust the government after hundreds of years of getting screwed over, right? That, some narco comes along and says, "Hey, I'm Robin Hood. I'm going to give you all this money." And I say, it's just like Escobar in Colombia. That was exactly how he played the game, right? He made himself into a hero amongst a certain group of people who really had no alternatives for moral leadership. And this is the same thing that happens down there. You have to present a strong alternative to what the narcos are doing. But I think one thing, the narcos are now pushing it too far. I think their level of violence has got to be turning even their most ardent apologists off, because it just seems like the violence is the point now. A smart organized crime uses violence very sparingly. It's the old mafia approach back when the mafia was on top of the game. They were very selective about who they went after. They had rules. And the main thing was making money. And I think that once organized crime forgets that, like a lot of corporations seem to forget that they want to make money. Like, I don't want to sell shoes to Republicans, people like this. It's like, well, Republicans buy lots of shoes too. He wonders sometimes where people lose the plot. It's about making money.
Yeah. I forgot the name of the guy I was listening to talk about this, but what is also helping the cartels down in Mexico is that they use kind of a cult-like ideology. So they've mixed what they're doing in with some of the spiritual customs, and now they're using some Catholic traditions and imagery to even justify all the violence. So a lot of the big things down there is the Santa Muerte, which is the holy death, and they like pray to it and all this stuff, and they got whole like villages and whole cities of people believing this, so it's like, oh yeah, death is a part of life. So it's almost like, these are our leaders now, this is, the death is everywhere. It's on everyone's side, regardless of whether you're a cop, whether you're a drug trafficker or government official. Death is it's gonna get us all in the end, and stuff like that. And it's it's getting even harder for people to even question them in that aspect, because they're like, well, this is something that they've built and they've got all these traditions and stuff like that. I heard some of their drug enforcement people, the ones who aren't corrupt, they can't take down any of the Santa Muerte imagery, even though it's heavily associated with the organized crime, because then it becomes a civil liberties violation and, freedom of religion and stuff like that. So it's crazy, because these things are everywhere and people pay homage to whatever spiritual thing they think is gonna help them make money, and it's ridiculous.
I remember looking for and finding the Jesus Malverde tattoos and the little dashboard guys they have, Santo Malverde. That was always, but it wasn't always associated with crime. It was, sometimes it was just poor people who thought of Jesus Malverde as Robin Hood, basically, literally. And so it's not always associated with organized crime, but it's really sad, isn't it, that this is, this is all people can expect from their society, that they have to worship death. It's pretty weird.
Yeah, I've seen videos of like, is it like Christian missionaries and stuff going down there and trying to get people to like, hey, this isn't right, and this is what's causing all this turmoil, and people are just not having it. Like they're literally throwing rocks at this guy.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. People think of Mexico as a Catholic country, but it's never really entirely been. There's always that sort of underlying indigenous faith there as well. And everywhere, this is one thing the Catholic Church was very good at, going to different places and then saying, oh, no, you keep your festivals, but just here's Jesus, get to know him and work him in there somehow, right? So, I mean, I guess it's fertile ground for that too.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've always thought is it's just so unfortunate, when evil people or people with ill intent, basically they learn from these kind of tactics to get one over on the populace.
Sure. I mean, look at how classic example is Stalin. Everything up till 1941 was communism. We don't want religion. We don't, the Imperial Russian past, we don't want to talk about that. But as soon as Hitler invaded, they rediscovered all these great heroes from the past and great Russia and the nationalist thing. And he used that very effectively to rally the population in a way that communism really couldn't, right? So that's a classic example of a guy mining the past for ammunition in the present. So many leaders do that.
Wow, yeah. So we're kind of approaching the end here. What's some positive things we can talk about?
My writing. Let's talk about how I got into writing. I basically started writing as a kind of a vehicle to vent my frustrations. I mean, people, I used to go on at length at work and people would call them G-rants, which is actually now the name of my Shopify store.
Nice.
The G-rant. And it's also the name of my podcast. I actually have a podcast. I started last year and I did like 50 episodes in like a short time. And then I stopped because I thought it was detracting from my fiction, which is my main thing now. I've written 18 books. Still looking for a publisher, but I figured out Amazon. So, my stuff is out there. Look for me on Amazon. And my two best that have done the best are Life on the Line, is my memoir of my time at the border, and a book called Bomber's Moon, which is set in the Second World War, and it's based kind of loosely on my great uncle's experiences in the Royal Canadian Air Force as part of Bomber Command, and that's another one that's done kind of okay for me. I'm hardly a household word, but part of my problem is I wind up on bookshelves next to James Patterson, who, this guy is something else. He doesn't even write his own books anymore. And yet he accounts for, get this, 17% of all books sold in the United States have James Patterson's name on them.
Wow.
So you imagine with my last name, there's like two shelves full of, James Patterson with Tom Schmuckberg, or James Patterson with Bill Clinton. He's not doing his own writing either. I don't know who wrote that one. And then there's my little offerings, but whatever. It's kind of funny. Anyways, writing's my thing now. It's kind of a passion, so I enjoy it. I've hopped across the genres now: memoir, opinion, historical fiction, science fiction, crime fiction, of course. So just whatever interests me.
Did that overlap with your time working at the border?
Yeah, I started writing my first book in 2012. And it took me something like 2.5 years to finish. And I've never put it out because it was a beginning effort, and it's not that polished. But then I very quickly began writing a series called the Will Bryant Thrillers that takes place in Brazil. And my wife is Brazilian. My kids were born there. I lived there for a time. So Brazil is a sort of natural home for those books. So yeah, I mean, I've written those, and then I've gotten into other things. I wrote a book I was talking about Stalin. I wrote a book set in Stalin's time, set in the purges of the mid-1930s, that I'm quite proud of, called the Troika of Osip Teitelbaum. And yeah, it started just as a way to vent fictionally, right? No real names and, no real secrets. But then eventually I just decided to go ahead and write a memoir because everybody was bugging me to do it. When are you going to write a book about the border? Well, I did. So
That's awesome. Grant, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. This is really, really good conversation. I love all the stories, and definitely going to check out that book. And I encourage my listeners to do so.
A Life on the Line, My Unexpected Career with the Canada Border Services Agency by Grant Patterson. Check it out. Awesome.
Do you have like a social media or website or anything like that?
I'm on Facebook sometimes, but they piss me off. So really I encourage you to go to my Amazon page and check that out. Like I said, I also have a Shopify store, the G Rant. It's got some merch. Because I'm told I should be into merch, loot, and swag, all of the above. But yeah, no, just check out the books. That's what I recommend. And thanks. It's been a great opportunity talking to you.
All right. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Take care, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. You too. What a crazy bunch of experiences. Grant, I want to thank you so much for sharing those with us. I definitely want to hear more, so I am for sure going to check out that book. To my listener, I encourage you to do the same. A Life on the Line is available on Amazon, and the link is in the description of this episode. I'm also including the links to G-Rants, both the podcast and the Shopify store. I encourage you to check those out if you want to learn more about Grant. Don't forget to follow and like the show on social media. The links to the Facebook and Instagram pages are also in the description. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or suggestions about the show. I promise I will not get mad at you if there's something that you don't like about the show. I am more than happy to hear you out and take constructive criticism. If you liked the episode, please share it with people. It's truly the best way for you to show your support. Because remember, actions speak louder than words, and talk is cheap. Until next time. Bye-bye.